Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name's Kaylee and these are my books. So today's video, I didn't even plan on doing this video this month, but I just realized I have a lot of books I need to unhaul, and there's also certain books that I need to go buy from the bookstore. So I'm like, might as well do an unhaul, take these books to half price books, and then do a book haul video. So this is going to be a video that includes both an unhaul, a book shopping vlog, so come shop with me, and a book haul at the end. So first thing I'm gonna do is go over the books that I am unhauling because I'm taking these to half price books. I'm gonna turn them into half price books. I know they don't give you a ton of money for your books, but I'm just lazy. There are two very specific books that I need to buy though, and I'm not sure they will be at half price books. So the first book I need to buy is Valor, which is book 2 to the Faithful and the Fallen series, which is Malice is book 1. That's why I'm holding it up, because I am reading Valor in November. I read Malice recently, loved it, and I need to get to book 2, but I want to own book 2. So I'm looking for Valor, and I'm looking for book 2 to the Shadow of What Was Lost series. I think it's called the Licanius trilogy. Licanius? I don't know, but the first book is called The Shadow of What Was Lost, and I need book 2, and I don't want to buy book 2 on Amazon because I've been seeing a lot of people buying it on Amazon and it's just the wrong size. It doesn't match up with book 1, so I'd rather buy book 2 in person somewhere. That way I can make sure it's the correct tall floppy version. So after half price books, I'm going to go to Barnes & Noble to buy the books I need, and then I'm going to Target because I do need to buy more dog food for this little boy, little Teddy here, and at Target, I of course need to look at the books too, so it's gonna be a book shopping vlog including half price books, Barnes & Noble, and Target. But before I go book shopping, I need to do some unhaul, and I have quite a few books on the ground that I'm looking at here. I'm unhauling 17 books. I'm gonna start with the fantasy books because it is a lot more fantasy books. 11 of the 17 books are fantasy, and then the last 6 books I talk about are just a mixture of horror, thriller, and sci-fi. So the first book I'm unhauling is very sad. It's The Goblin Emperor. I bought this recently because I know my friends Emma and Maria really love this book, and I'm sad to say I tried this and I DNF'd it. I can see why some people would like it. It's very, very character focused. For me, it was just too character focused and I wanted a bit more plot. I found myself getting too bored. And so since I DNF'd it, there's no reason for me to hold on to my copy, and I'm gonna unhaul this. This book is an adult epic fantasy book that follows a newly minted emperor because he wasn't in line for the throne. Well, he was in line, but he wasn't like next in line for the throne, but then his family all dies, and it's kind of a mystery of why they died or how they died, and he gets thrown into being the leader of this kingdom, country, imperial court. And so he is just trying to figure out what happened to his family and also trying to figure out how to navigate this intensely political setting. I normally really like political fantasies, but I needed a bit more world building from this book than we got. This was very much localized, very, very much focused just on slice of life for this guy that becomes the emperor. And I think I just wanted a more expansive plot than what we got. Next up, I'm unhauling Serpent and Dove. This is, I think it's new adult, a new adult / upper YA fantasy romance book. And I actually loved this when I read it. I gave it 5 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. It's definitely, heavy on the romance. You're reading this for the romance, in my opinion. It's a romance where it starts as enemies to lovers. It's arranged marriage. It follows a witch and a witch hunter. But I've heard that book 2 and the rest of the series honestly just goes way downhill. So for a long time, I thought about this book as a standalone because I actually was kind of happy with how it ended. And as time has passed and I've explored more fantasy romance, especially after discovering Kindle Unlimited, this book has really just faded in my mind. And while it was really enjoyable at the time, and I stand by my high rating of this book, I don't see myself ever coming back to this book, and because the rest of the series I'm not interested in, there's no reason for me to keep this book on my shelves. Next up is For the Wolf. This is another fantasy romance book where it's a Beauty and the Beast / Red Riding Hood retelling, and one daughter is for the throne. First daughter is for the throne, becomes the queen. The second daughter is for the wolf, and so basically it's like folk tale magic where the woods are very creepy. The trees are alive and there's this brutal wolf that lives out in the forest, and you have to sacrifice the second daughter of the royal family. Every couple of years, I think it's like maybe every 50 years or something like that, you have to sacrifice the second daughter so that the wolf stays in the forest and doesn't come to devour the people. And of course, this is a romance between the second daughter and the wolf, because the wolf ends up not being what she anticipates him being. In theory, I should have loved this book. I don't know why I didn't connect to it. I found it really boring and I ended up DNFing it, unfortunately. It just wasn't fast moving enough for me, and the focus wasn't where I wanted it to be. I was reading this book much more so for the romance, and the fantasy elements I wasn't the biggest fan of, and this does have a lot of fantasy elements in it. Of course, it's a fantasy romance. Let me clarify what I mean. Some fantasy romances, the focus is much more on the romance, like in Serpent and Dove, in my opinion. In this book, I think the focus is split between fantasy and romance. And as a fantasy reader, that's usually fine with me, but I just didn't like the type of fantasy that this book was portraying. It's very much a whimsical fantasy. It's fantasy that's focused on vibes, where it's the creepy trees, the magical forest, the wolf in the woods, and I like my fantasy to be a bit less whimsical and more down to earth, I guess is what I'm saying. But at the end of the day, this book sadly did not work for me, so I am unhauling it. Next up is The Star-Touched Queen. I read this, I think, back in high school or maybe like early undergrad. Basically, I read this many years ago and I loved it. It is a YA fantasy romance, but I don't remember a ton from it. I'm never going to reread it because while I loved it at the time, it wasn't a favorite. So I have no nostalgic attachment to this book. I was really just keeping it because I love the cover, but I need the space on my shelves. I'm never gonna reread this book. It's lost to time. I had a good time with it, 5, 6, 7 years ago when I read it, but it's time to unhaul. Next up is another YA fantasy series, and while this one I didn't have a ton of nostalgic attachment to, this series I do have a ton of nostalgic attachment to, and it's why I've held on to it for so long. And this is the Winter's Trilogy. I actually don't know if that's the official name of the trilogy or not, but I'm talking about the Winter's Curse, the Winter's Crime, and the Winter's Kiss. I loved the series when I was, I think, 18 or so. This was one of my favorite series of all time. I mean, it's really frustrating that I have 2 paperbacks and 1 hardcover, but I think I was reading it whenever this hardcover just came out, so that's why I finished book 2 and had to immediately go out and buy the hardcover because I was so in love with it, even though it's so annoying to have this on your shelves. But this is another fantasy series that also has a lot of romance in it. And if I remember correctly, it's inspired by the Roman Empire. And I still do highly recommend this as a YA fantasy trilogy. It's just I've really moved on from YA, and while I have nostalgic attachment to it, I'm never going to reread these books, and I hate how they sit on my shelves with 2 paperbacks and 1 hardcover. So I'm just gonna get rid of them. That way I can fill up my shelves with new favorites instead of having my shelves being dominated by old favorites. Next up is in a similar vein to the last trilogy I just unhauled, and it is A Reaper at the Gates. I read the last book to this series pretty recently. I mean, the last book came out recently. And so this isn't a nostalgic favorite because I still liked it as the last book just came out. So this series is a more recent favorite. And this is, I don't even know which book. I think this is book 3 in the series. The first one is An Ember in the Ashes. But between finishing this series, which it's a series of 4 books, and now I've really abandoned YA fantasy and have moved almost entirely into adult fantasy. There are still a couple YA fantasies that I own and haven't read yet that I want to give a try, but because I've read this series before, there's no space on my shelves. I would be unhauling the whole series, but the other books I think are back at my parents' house still. They've just never made it over to where I live in Texas now, and so I only actually have this book here. But once I get those books, maybe I'll keep the first book to the series, An Ember in the Ashes, but these books are so big. I mean, they're not that big, but they're just big hardcovers, and they're fairly long. They're like all around 400 to 500 pages. They could take up a lot of space on my shelves, and I would just rather, like I said, have space for all the new chunky adult fantasy that I've been reading, because as you can see, my shelves are already pretty full and I don't have a ton of space for extra shelves, so I need to get rid of stuff, and this book unfortunately did not make the cut. This series also annoys me because I bought the first two in the old version of the hardcovers and the last two are in the new version, and I like both versions, like both versions are fine. It's just so annoying to me that the first two books don't match the last two books. And so maybe if they all matched and they would look nice on my shelves all together, I would keep them. But because they look so disjointed, because they're totally different styles, if you don't know, this series went through a cover reimagining when book 3 was released. And so the first two covers that I have for book 1 and book 2 do not follow this style. Now, if you buy book 1 and book 2, they are in the style and they would all match, but mine don't match. And it bugs me. So I'm not gonna keep them because I'm not gonna reread them and they don't look nice on my shelves because they are disjointed. Therefore, I am unhauling this book. But again, I would highly recommend this series for any people that are looking for YA fantasy recommendations, and Ember in the Ashes, the series is fantastic. Next up, I'm getting rid of Graceling. I loved this book way back in the day, but it's been a long time since I read it, and I actually was wanting to reread it recently because it's just been so long and I remember loving this book. I love when books feature assassin characters, which this book does. This is another YA fantasy. If you weren't aware, this is an iconic YA fantasy. Graceling kind of started a huge trend, but recently I actually read for the first time the graphic novel version of Graceling, and I feel like I got what I needed from it. That worked for me as a reread, and I no longer feel the need to reread this book because I don't want to read it and I have no plans to reread this in the future. I just need the space on my shelf, so I'm going to unhaul it. But once again, if you like YA fantasy and you haven't read this book yet, I highly recommend Graceling. Next up are two books by the same author, but they're both part of different series though. The Demon King and The Warrior Heir. I have not read these books, so I'm unhauling them while I still haven't read them. I just have no interest in reading them. The other YA fantasy that I own and I haven't read yet, I have way more of an interest in reading. These are just quite old now, and I think if I'm going to try out a YA fantasy, I would rather try out a newer YA fantasy. That way I could participate in current discussions about the books instead of reading these books that are so old. They're not like crazy old, but you know, they haven't been released within the past couple of years. And yes, I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm just not really a big YA fantasy reader anymore, and so I'm being really picky about which YA fantasies I still want to give a try, and these two just did not make the cut. I'm so angry right now. I almost just considered scrapping this whole video because I realized my camera freaking cut off because my storage was full, and I just finished talking about all 17 or 18 of these books, and I got up to check the wonderful video I created and it wasn't there. It wasn't there. It cut off. Oh my god. Luckily, it didn't cut off at the beginning, but still, I have like 7 books I need to re-talk about now. Weirdly, it cut off right when I was done with the fantasy books, so it was just like, okay, you're done talking about fantasy and we're done, because this is a fantasy channel. I'm kidding, it's not a fantasy channel. This is a variety channel, but my phone wants it to be a fantasy channel, apparently. So I have 7 more books to talk about. 4 of them are horror, 2 of them are thrillers, and 1 of them is sci-fi. So I'm going to start with the horror, and the first of which is World War Z by Max Brooks. This is an iconic book. It's about a zombie plague that turns into a zombie war, and this is a weird one because I DNF'd this after 20 pages. Normally I give my books much more of a chance before I end up DNFing, but I could just tell from the first 20 pages that the writing style was not for me. I felt too distant from the characters because it's so choppy. We're switching around point of view so much because the focus is on the world. It's not on any individual character experiencing this apocalyptic situation. I can see why so many people like this. It's just the writing style wasn't for me, and because I DNF'd it, it shouldn't be on my shelf, and therefore I'm unhauling it. Next up is The Deep. I read this for a water horror vlog video, and I gave it 2 stars in that video, but upon further reflection, it is 1 star. I just really did not enjoy this book. I found it incredibly boring and kind of offensive at times. There is a scene in here that I believe is quite fatphobic, and I could see the argument being made that it is only fatphobic in the character's mind and not necessarily a stance that the book agrees with, but I could also see the other argument that part of the horror of the scene is the character's size of their body, and that just isn't cool with me. But it's such a short moment in this book. That is not the main reason why I'm getting rid of it. That is just one of my many issues I had with this book. Ultimately, I found this book incredibly boring because the focus is split between flashback scenes and current day scenes, and the end of the book never gives us a purpose to the flashbacks, in my opinion. And therefore, I'm like, what was the point of me suffering through a million flashback scenes for them to not tie into the end? So basically, the plot of this book is there is an epidemic that is happening in the world where people are forgetting things. People are forgetting at first normal things, but then they become more and more important things they are forgetting, like how to eat, how to drink, how to breathe, and therefore people are dying. And so they think, the scientists in this story think that they found the cure to this disease at the bottom of the ocean in this trench. And so they take a submarine down, they have the science outpost down at the bottom of the ocean, but there's some creepy things down there and they might not be safe. The premise sounds amazing, but it just somehow was incredibly boring. So because I hated this book, I'm unhauling it. From that same video, I read another book called The Deep, but this one is by Alma Katsu, and I gave this book 2 stars. Didn't hate it as much as the Nick Cutter Deep. This is just not the book for me. In my opinion, this is much more a historical fiction book than a horror book. And this is a historical fiction novel that we follow one woman who is both on the sinking of the Titanic and the sinking of the Britannica. Apparently the unluckiest woman alive. And it's just about her surviving the Titanic sinking only to be on the Britannica a couple of years later. This has some supernatural moments, and we also get a lot of slice of life moments of people on the Titanic and people on the Britannica, just about ship life. And it felt too slice of life for me, too historical fiction for me, and the action of the sinking of the ships doesn't happen until like the last 20 pages. So I needed way more action, way more horror in this story for me to care. But if you like historical fiction, I would recommend this. Historical fiction is not my preferred genre, so that's why I gave it 2 stars, and that's why I'm unhauling it. Next up is Echo. I read this book in October. I unfortunately gave it 2 stars. It is quite long. It's 400 pages, but you can kind of see that the text is quite small and doesn't have as big of margins. I mean, the audiobook is 19 hours, and a 19-hour audiobook does not normally correlate with 400 pages. So I believe that this book is actually quite a bit longer than a typical 400-page book, and it felt long. I liked this book for the first like 75-ish pages. That's why I'm giving it 2 stars instead of 1 star, but then it just completely lost me in the later half. So this is a story about a man who goes on a hiking trip, has a horrible accident, his face is gone, he's in the hospital, his partner comes to stay with him at the hospital and take care of him because he's gonna need a lifelong caregiver. So it's horrific in the sense that your romantic partner now needs your care 24/7. I mean, that is a huge responsibility suddenly given to this man. But the hiker's accident seems to have affected his personality, seems to have affected him in more ways than just the physical, and it's kind of a question of what did he bring back from the mountain. But because I didn't like this story, I was quite bored by most of the story, I'm going to unhaul it. Next up are 2 thrillers I'm getting rid of, the first of which is The Perfect Stranger by Megan Miranda. I read this in a thriller reading vlog and I gave it 2 stars. I just have found that I like thrillers that are a bit more wild, a bit more crazy, a bit more unhinged, I guess you could say. And Megan Miranda's writing always stays fairly tame. I was just bored by this book. I wanted much more from the story than we got given. The twists are like barely twists, they're barely there in my opinion, and the mystery doesn't have a lot of intrigue for me. There's not really any thrilling moments in this. This is almost much more of a contemporary than a thriller in my opinion. A contemporary with some mysterious elements. But a lot of people don't like those super wild thrillers, and so if you want something that's a bit more realistic, I think you would really enjoy Megan Miranda's writing. I'm just not looking for realism in my thrillers, honestly. I just want to be entertained by crazy plot lines. So Megan Miranda is not the author for me on learning, and therefore I am unhauling The Perfect Stranger, even though the cover is beautiful. Next up, I'm unhauling The Wife Upstairs. I ended up giving this book 3 stars, so I didn't absolutely hate it. It was just incredibly average to me. A domestic thriller that's inspired by Jane Eyre, and because I know Jane Eyre so well, I found myself not surprised by anything that happens, because in my opinion, the twist of Jane Eyre is the exact same twist in this book, and so you're not going to be surprised if you are familiar with Jane Eyre. I could see how a lot of people would like this book if they don't know Jane Eyre very well though, but because I didn't have that twist, there just wasn't enough intrigue for me throughout the story to also not be surprised by the twist, and therefore I gave it 3 stars. I don't need to keep this on my shelves, and I am unhauling it. Even though I love Rachel Hawkins' other book, The Reckless Girls, which I gave 5 stars and is one of my favorite thrillers of all time, The Wife Upstairs is just exceedingly average. And the last book I'm unhauling is Artemis by Andy Weir. This is sad because Andy Weir is one of my favorite authors because I absolutely adore The Martian and Project Hail Mary, but Artemis was bad. I gave this book 2 stars. I didn't think it was like absolutely horrible, but it was just bad. It was boring. The stakes were so low that I didn't end up caring. Our main character is quite unlikable, and I don't always need my characters to be likable, but there just wasn't anything else in the story for me to care about. So if the character was also unlikable, she wasn't unlikable in an interesting way. She was just unlikable in a way that made me completely indifferent to her story. So I'm unhauling this book. That way I never have to look at Artemis again and never be sad that Andy Weir had a miss for me. Alright, that is my second time unhauling those books, but I am unhauling all of these books. I think there's actually 18 books here. I miscounted at the beginning. So I am unhauling 18 books. I'm taking them to half price books. I'm expecting to get a voucher somewhere between $20 and $30 from them, which is enough for me to pick up maybe 1 or 2 books from the store, maybe 3 books if we find some cheap ones, which is very exciting. I'm not expecting to find the books I need to buy at half price books just because their selection is so varied. It would be wonderful to find the books at half price books. But either way, I'm going to be going to Barnes & Noble afterwards to pick up the books I actually need, and then to Target and just kind of browse the books there. I don't expect to buy any of the books at Target, but because I have to go there either way to pick up Teddy's food, I figured I'd film some of their book selections because I always like looking at different stores' book selections. So I'm going to now cut to me walking around half price books. So I definitely forgot that PetSmart is right next to half price books, and now I don't need to go to Target anymore. So sorry, we're just going to half price books and Barnes & Noble today. So I just finished up in half price books and I got 4 books. So quick book haul. I ended up finding, which I'm really excited about, Tristan Strong punches a hole in the sky. This is the first book in the series, and I've been really wanting to try the series, and you can see it was only like $4. Oh god, there's someone right next to me in the car. Awkward. It was only like $4.50, so really good deal. I'm excited to try this book. I want to get to this soon because I'm trying to do a vlog sometime in the next couple of weeks where I read middle grade fantasy, and I think this is a great one to try. And then I also got The Haunting of Alcott Manor. Now this is my wild card because I actually looked this up on Goodreads, and it only has about 100 reviews, and no one that I am friends with on Goodreads has read it. It was $7, so not too expensive, and this is described as a gothic romance story where this woman has to go back to her family's like old home and try to solve a ghost mystery in the home, and she falls in love with someone. Oh, no. Okay, so the girl works for a, like, paranormal ghost hunting business. That's a family business, and she wants to quit, so this is her last job. And the guy, this is the guy's family house. So they kind of meet in the house because they're both trying to solve this mystery. He hired her, and I think they fall in love, and they also solve a ghost story. So it sounds pretty fun. And then I also grabbed the third book in the Wheel of Time series, and it's a nice floppy edition. My other two are the like small mass market paperbacks, not in great condition, and this one actually looks fairly brand new, and it was $11.50, so a bit more expensive, but I'm happy about this. I still haven't started the Wheel of Time series, but now I have the first 3 books in that series. And then I also found The Legacy of Ash by Matthew Ward. This was $8, a really good price for this book. It is a little bit bent in the corner, but you know, I think it's in good quality besides that, and this is very chunky. But I've been wanting to read this book because I think Cassidy really liked this story, and the cover is really cool, and this is an adult epic fantasy. I really know no plot details though, so I can't tell you about it, but I did grab this one. And I only ended up paying $6 total for all of those books because the books that I brought in, the credit I got paid for the rest. The only book they didn't take was Artemis, so I still have Artemis, which I'll just put back on my shelves for now. They said they had too many Artemises, they're not able to sell it, the Artemis by Andy Weir, which I don't blame people because that book is bad. I understand why they're not able to sell it. And then I got Teddy's food, a little dog food haul too. I got this big bag of his refrigerated food, and it was 50% off because it goes bad in 2 weeks, which is cool because Teddy will go through that bag in 2 weeks before it's bad, and so it's just nice to only pay for 50% of it. But because that needs to be refrigerated, I'm gonna be fast in Barnes & Noble. I am still gonna go to Barnes & Noble. It's not super hot outside. It's only like 70 degrees, so I think if I'm fast in Barnes & Noble, the food will be fine in the car for a little bit. So I'm gonna go to Barnes & Noble. I'm gonna hopefully find the 2 books that I need to find because obviously they weren't at half-price books, and then I'll do a little haul in the car. But for now, I'll cut to me walking around Barnes & Noble. All right, so I'm all done in Barnes & Noble. I ended up getting the books that I expected to get. I didn't get any more because they're already kind of expensive just to get these two. But I got an Echo of Things to Come, which is book 2 to the first book being Shadow of What Was Lost. Excited for this. Look at this chunk, but it's so floppy and nice. And then I also grabbed Valor by John Gwynne. Again, quite chunky and quite floppy. Love it. I'm so excited for both of these. They were all together were like $38, and that was even with my membership, so kind of expensive. But, you know, at least they're both really chunky, so I'm getting quite a few pages for the price. But that is the end of this video. I ended up getting 6 books, and I got rid, well, I tried to get rid of 18, but they didn't take one of them. So I got rid of 17. I brought in 6 books, so I'm still net down 11 books, which I think is great. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a like and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you next time. Bye!